Much, Owen. Hi everyone. I'm delighted to be invited to interview Elaine on this, because this is a topic close to my own heart, and I think the book is wonderful. So the first thing on any book launch event is to say, go and buy it, go onto the Four Courts Press website and take advantage of the discount that's there. It's a really excellent book. Not just as a researcher, I found it really useful, but it prompted me to think about elections and electioneering in a whole set of new ways. So it's I think it's a real addition to the field. So congratulations, Elaine, well done on it. Can I just start off maybe it struck me as I was reading the book and preparing for today, what drew you to this period and to the elections in this period particularly? What was it that attracted you to this and the amount of work that you put into this? What pulled you to this topic?
Well, a couple of things actually drew me to the topic. First of all, before returning to study history, I spent a life in public relations. I worked for Wilson Hartnell Public Relations. So I always had an interest in marketing, in public relations and in advertising. So that whetted my appetite from that perspective. The other thing that I always had an interest in was politics. I mean, I'm kind of a politics junkie. So really the work is a combination of those two interests. It's a combination of public relations and advertising and Irish history. But the other thing that I really wanted to get to the bottom of in all of this is to look back into what motivated the ordinary person to change their minds. Because we can look at the big events like the Easter Rising or the War of Independence, but not everybody was involved in those. I mean, the ordinary man / woman didn't necessarily participate, but they did change their minds at some point in time. So what motivated them to do that? And that's what I was interested in.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. The big bright light events like the Easter Rising and military attacks and so forth are huge and get all the headlines, but everybody goes into the booth, or everybody with the vote goes into privacy of the booth at a moment and has to make a decision on what persuades them. I think is really interesting. I should just say to people before we move on with the interview, if questions occur to you, we will be taking questions. There'll be plenty of time for a good thrashing out of questions and answers at the end. If you have a question, do please drop it into the Q&A at the end. You'll see at the end of your screen, at the bottom of the screen, a Q&A box. Drop in a question there, and then Elaine and I will talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then I'll start taking questions from the Q&A section at the bottom. So do please drop questions in as they occur to you, and I'll come back through them. And nothing too hard, but having read Elaine's book, I think that you can answer any question on the period, to be honest. Just to set the scene, Elaine, for sort of listeners and viewers who might be as familiar with the period, can you just say, in a basic way, what parties were active at the time, what elections took place, and who had the vote? So just kind of set up kind of the building blocks of what we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit of a different political scene than what we're familiar with at the moment. You had, I suppose, four main political interests. That's probably the best way to describe it. You had the Irish Parliamentary Party, and they'd been in existence really since about 1870, and their main drive was trying to achieve home rule for Ireland. It's important to remember this was the time when Ireland was under British rule, and they were seeking to create a government or parliament in Dublin. And then, of course, opposing that idea were the Unionists. And Unionists, by their very name, want to maintain the union between Britain and Ireland. The new party in on the scene was Sinn Féin. It had originally been founded by Arthur Griffith as a kind of, and existed as a small monarchical party, but it's going to shift a little bit in this time and seek complete separation from Britain. And then also in the mix is the Labour movement, or Labour Party, and known at the time as the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party, but for the sake of ease, let's just call them Labour. And there were some other small movements and some other even small labour movements at the time, but they are the four main political interests. And the reason, or these elections that took place, well, that's the other reason they whetted my appetite, because they are the last elections to take place in this country in an all-island context. So they happened just before partition. And the by-elections in 1917, 1918 by-elections usually are not interesting, but these ones are particularly interesting because they begin to give an indication that maybe change is afoot on the island. And then that's followed by the big 1918 general election, which happens at the end of the First World War. And there has been massive and sweeping changes across Europe. So it's interesting to see, well, has things changed or did things change in Ireland in these election times as well? They're followed by the local elections of 1920. And the local elections are interesting because they are, you know, these are elections taken at the urban and rural level. And so they give kind of an insight into the mindset of the ordinary person at the very local level to see what way are they casting votes, even though as a local election, I mean, by-elections aren't interesting, local elections are usually not interesting, but these ones are. And then of course you have the 1921 election, which is the one that's literally on the eve of partition.
Yeah, I mean, it's a point really struck me reading the book was, we tend to look at elections and say, right, there were 3 competitors or 5 competitors and this person won, and you forget about the lead up to the moment of the count. And you're approaching it from the point of view of all the things they were considering before we knew what the outcome was. There was no guaranteed winners, and in the lead up and in the campaign, it's an open game for everyone. And that really struck me, that notion of what was at stake for all the parties in these elections. We now look backwards and just see the winner, but there were all the competitors at the time and those sort of factors at play. But if we were to take like a time travel machine back to Ireland in 1917 or the 1920, well, that period through the 1918 election, any of the by-elections, what would look different to us now? We're very familiar with posters and what we see for election time now, posters on lampposts and leaflets to the door, and we all get sort of election fatigue by the time the count comes around. But what would be different if we were to travel back? What would we notice?
Well, you'd notice visually, you'd notice a few things. So I'll just pick a couple just to explain. I'm not here all day. But one of the things that you'd notice quite clearly, if you were to step back in time, is that it's almost festival-like. An election is almost, particularly the big general elections. There's a huge amount of bunting and banners and posters. And of course, they're all biased towards whichever side is seeking a vote. So, you know, across Ireland, you would have had, you know, the tricolour, you would have had the colour green representing the Irish Parliamentary Party, you would have had the red, white and blue representing the Union. And all of this was draped in flags and banners across the country. But perhaps what's more interesting back then than is now, I mean, removing the fact that there's no television, there's no radio, and there's no social media, that just did not exist. The big thing that existed was posters, and they were extraordinarily creative. I mean, when we look at election posters today, they're bland, they're boring, they're repetitive, and all you see is smiling faces, vote for so-and-so. But when you go back to the elections of this era, they are putting out their policies, their plans, their ideas, both in lengthy posters and in short, snappy posters. So it's really the visual impact of elections back then. And of course, you've no moratoriums. So you're being hampered right up to the moment of literally
walking in the gate.
And that was the other difference. I mean, some of these elections at the time didn't use the same voting method that we use today. Today we use proportional representation. That only comes in for the 1920 local elections. Before that, we have a system, the first past the post system, and that's literally where you mark an X in the box opposite the name of the candidate you want to elect.
It's just one, yeah.
Yeah, you only vote one person. So it's a system that's actually still in use in Britain today, but we've switched since 1920 over to proportional representation. So that's another big difference. And the major difference, of course, at the time is that women can vote. I mean, they could vote in local elections up to this point, but this is the first time, 1918 is the first time that women are going to be able to cast a vote. So, I mean, that even causes, you know, quite interesting newspaper coverage on the event as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What you mentioned about the sort of sense of carnival or festival about it, I think is interesting, that it was, and having women as new voters in the parliamentary election must have really added a sense of novelty and festival to it, even more so, that notion of I know many could vote in the local elections, but that they can go and vote at last. They've got this much sought after franchise. And just as you mentioned there about the bunting and the colours, it was a thing that struck me that I never thought of before when I was reading through the book. Of course, the existence of the tricolour bunting was a novelty. So people were used to green for the Nationalist Party, green for the Irish Parliamentary Party, and red, white and blue. But the existence of green, white and orange, or green, white and yellow bunting kind of stood out. And you have some nice quotes about people describing the bunting on the streets and the orange shining in the sunshine and that sort of stuff. So that sense of there's something new, something different about these elections. A, women voters. B, you have a lot more voters. And C, you've got the different colours visible in the contest. So I think it must have been a very exciting time. But yeah, I'd love to have travelled back to see it. In the book, you talk about there being a need for more research into women as voters and women's political activism after suffrage. So we have all the early Edwardian period trying to get the vote, and then they get the vote in 1918, or a proportion of women get the vote in 1918. But in the book, you touch on, can you just expand on which parties were better at attracting women voters? You had this huge, important new block of voters that had never been available to the parties before. Did they go after them? Did they consciously target women as a new market, if you want to put it that way, or did they just assume women were going to vote like their husbands voted? I mean, how did they approach this new body of voters?
No, surprisingly enough, actually, they didn't. They took the women's vote quite seriously. Well, put it this way: Sinn Féin and Unionists took the women's vote very seriously. And they were particularly active in appealing to women, and not only to vote for them, but to also canvass on their behalf. And the Labour movement were actually good at trying to appeal to women to become actively involved also. So women did, and they were particularly involved in the door-to-door canvass on behalf of whatever party they wanted to support. Unionists were also good at encouraging women to hold, meetings for other women and to bring in women speakers at those meetings to encourage other women to cast their votes the Unionist way. And certainly, when we look at the work that Sinn Féin put into appealing to women, and we look at the work that Unionists did, I think it did pay off on polling day. We'll never know exactly how women voted because, the votes they don't exist anymore. But I don't think they were honorary voters. I think that women did make up their own minds. And certainly, as I said already, if you look at the news coverage, there was a large turnout of women. The Irish Times, for example, on polling day reported something to the effect that the number of women that had voted by 3 p.m. Was much higher than that of men. So it paid off. And then later, the following year, the Irish Citizen, the suffrage newspaper, were kind of thrilling at the fact that that women who had, been very hostile towards the Irish Parliamentary Party had played a large part in their annihilation in the 1918 election. So that there's a couple of witty comments throughout the newspapers as well on the fact that, husbands were left without dinners and babies, were still washed and fed, even though women were given the vote. So it's I would say that, that those two parties did very well. The Irish Parliamentary Party did not, but a lot of that was mainly to do back with the whole suffrage movement and their comments or lack of wanting to give the vote to women during the suffrage campaign. And this kind of came back to haunt them in 1918. And I think women turned against them for that very reason. During the 1918 general election, the Irish Women's Franchise League reminded John Dillon, who was the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party at the time, that he had previously stated that he hoped women would never get the vote as it would mean the disturbing of Western civilization. So needless to say, I don't think women were too enamored with the Irish Parliamentary Party. So yeah, I would say that, they did appeal to women. They appealed directly. The only one that really did so in terms of the Irish Parliamentary Party was Joseph Devlin up in Belfast, who addressed all his, paid for newspaper advertising to ladies and gentlemen or Irish men and Irish women. So he was quite equal as well.
I wonder, was that his personal position, I wonder, or was he sort of seeing what the unionists were doing because he's operating in this strongly unionist area? Was he just seeing what the competition were doing to sort of inspire him to go that way?
I don't actually know because he never personally says so, or there's no indication of it. But I would say that he picked up on it very quickly that Sinn Féin were doing this and unionists were doing this. So he cottoned on and went down that route as well.
So, market forces. As you mentioned there, just that notion of Sinn Féin were doing it and the unionists were doing this, it again struck me going through the book that we think of politically Sinn Féin and the unionists as being poles apart. They're opposite ends of the political spectrum completely, and their ambitions for Ireland. Sinn Féin wanting complete separation and the unionists wanting complete union. But in their approach, like it really struck me that it's sort of the modern approach to organisation, to marketing, to advertising. I mean, is that the real revolution? Was well, that's a surprising thing, that the commonality between Sinn Féin and the unionists both taking this very modern approach, far more than the Irish Parliamentary Party did. They're much more similar in their behaviour in the election, I think, in adopting modern advertising and marketing processes. Would you agree that that there is something going on there? There's a kind of a modern moment.
Yeah, I do agree with you. But I think the unionist side had already got a past in this. I mean, if you think back to the big anti-home rule campaign of 1912, where you saw, this drive by, and I would say it was largely motored by James Craig during the time, and he managed to get thousands out onto the streets, thousands to sign the Solemn League and Covenant. They had some really witty propaganda messages to do with home rule. I mean, we're all very familiar of the kind of tumbling down Parliament building with the statues of Redmond and everybody out in the front of it. So they already had quite good expertise. But the other important thing that was happening during this time, well, a couple of things. Consumer marketing was taking place on a rather large scale. This is the era of the foundation of the department store. They'd been coming in since the mid to late 1800s. So and the department stores were very good at selling their wares and selling their produce. The other great innovation is in newspapers themselves, particularly in newspapers like the Irish Independent. I mean, the Irish Independent were now featuring images and pictures in their advertisements. Now, political parties didn't use images and pictures because that was expensive, but they certainly used the new increased and different font sizes and all that to drive home their messages. And the other thing is there were advertising agencies being created in Dublin. You had the likes of the Kevin Kenny Agency. McConnell's had established in 1916. You had Wilson Hartnell Agency since 1879. So there was a kind of an awareness that, marketing and advertising was turning professional. And Sinn Féin actually were very clever at spotting this and very clever at spotting what was going on in the United States as well. And there was an article written called The Advertising Problem. And it was published in a publication called Larna Heron by the Sinn Féin National Council. And this actually encouraged, Sinn Féin people to study United States advertising and to, to emulate what was going on and adapt it for the Irish market. So there was a number of different kind of advertising and public relations things going on at the time as well. And just finally, the other big thing was that the Great War had introduced this whole concept of mass media propagandizing. This was a world that moved into trying to sway whole nations to do something. So, political advertising or political propaganda picked up on this and used the same methods. So they used a combination of methods to reach out to people, not only just posters and things like that, but think of the big political rallies that happened during this time as well.
Yeah, totally.
So mass media propaganda came in because of the Great War.
A couple of things come in on that just you spark in my head as you're saying that. A is that the all-pervasive nature of the Great War just affects every part of the world, every part of life, and Ireland isn't just remote from the war at all. And then the international effect of, again, Ireland being connected to these modern movements in America, these modern business and advertising and marketing movements in America. But I've lost my own train of thought there with that. But when you talk about maybe an older form of marketing that you just touched on there, these mass rallies. So when I think of elections at the time, I think of these great photographs. I mean, the National Library have them. You see them in a lot of textbooks and things of, say, Michael Collins addressing huge crowds in Cork, or Dev addressing crowds. And even you see back to the Home Rule crisis, you'll see Carson and Redmond addressing vast crowds in Belfast or Waterford. It often struck me, you don't see any microphones, you don't see even bullhorns that they're shouting through. They're not even shouting through like a cone. They're just standing on a platform. You can see that they're bellowing because there's a kind of a sense of energy about the photograph, but can they really be heard at the back of the crowd? What's going on there in that sort of mass rally setup?
Yeah, and it is fascinating. And I suppose the important thing to remember is that this was one of the main ways that candidates, political candidates, whether they were at the top end, the likes of De Valera or Carson or that kind of thing, or whether they were just the local candidate, the main way of reaching out to an audience was to meet them. You didn't have, as I've already said, you'd no other mass media besides print media. The other reason why this worked is because people at the time didn't have the distractions that we have today. So going to a political rally was actually fun. And hundreds, even in local towns, gathered to hear the main speaker speak. There was no microphone, so it was difficult for people to hear what the speaker was saying unless you were in the immediate vicinity of it. But that was neither here nor there. That's not why you went. You went for the whole ambience of the meeting. And you also went in some instances because political rivalry could break out, and it could break out in the form of fisticuffs between rival factions. For example, you could have verbal arguments or verbal sparring between Sinn Féin and, say, the Irish Parliamentary Party, who'd hurl abuse at each other from the audience as this happened. Sometimes that degenerated down into physical violence. I mean, sometimes the Irish volunteers on the Sinn Féin side and the Hibernians on the Irish parliamentary side would actually arrive at these political rallies armed with hurley sticks, ready for the fight. And the fight often happens. And we see particularly violent fights at public meetings in Waterford and Mayo, particularly Ballahart, I can never say this name, Ballahart, thank you, in Mayo, which is the hometown of John Dillon. And when Sinn Féin, for example, arrived into the town to make their speeches and all the rest of it, and led by a marching band, which was another big way of kind of promoting political parties, they were met as they approached the town with stone throwing and bottles being hurled at them by Irish Parliamentary Party supporters. And then Sinn Féin replied to that by shooting off revolvers. So, some people came to these kind of events because all this was going on. On the negative side, some stayed away in some of the violent constituencies because this was going on. But and you also see then that plays out into poster campaigns, because the likes of the Irish Parliamentary Party uses their posters to vilify Sinn Féin because of the violence that occurs, and accuses them of being the party of violence and intimidation. And unionists do this against Sinn Féin as well. So this kind of public gathering is fun, it's exciting, it's the best way to see your candidate. And when you think of the big lads at the top, like the Michael Collinses or the Eamon De Valeras or the Edward Carsons, they are kind of, they're revered by their supporters at their time. It's like the pop star coming to town,
the real celebrity status. I suppose to be in their presence, just to be at the rally where they were there, even if you can't hear a word, it's you've seen the concert from the back row, sort of thing.
Well, this is the thing, and of course for the candidates themselves, the important thing was, yes, to be seen at these speeches and to make these speeches. But then the more important thing was to get that speech published in the provincial or national newspaper subsequently, because that was the only way really that people got to see what was being said and see the policies of the parties.
So you get the event on that afternoon, and you go home and read it in the papers next morning.
Read it in the paper, yeah,
that makes sense. And again, the importance of the provincial press. The provincial press was so key in this period to everything. The notion, I mean, you mentioned touching there on the violence, and then even on the volunteers, the Hibernians, and this, obviously the period is a period of revolution, a total upheaval. But is it not remarkable that for all the upheaval, you've got you've got sort of the threatened nearly civil war over home rule, you've got the Great War, you've got the 1916 Rising, War of Independence, but they keep coming back to electoral politics. They keep coming back to, like, there's guns and bombs and there's an awareness of the power of physical force, but yet they drifted all the way back towards campaigning and the ballot box and electioneering and getting a mandate. I mean, does that say anything about the Irish mindset, or are we very deeply democratic that no one said, well, let's just make this into a military dictatorship, whoever has the most guns wins, or like they constantly drift back to electioneering? Have you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that, well, the Irish Parliamentary Party were very much invested in this kind of idea of statecraft, and electioneering in order to gain their ends. And to be fair to Sinn Féin, once they got over, well, Sinn Féin and the events that were going on, in fairness, Sinn Féin weren't involved in the Easter Rising, even though they were accused of it.
Indeed.
And they took the blame, and they were delighted with it subsequently, because it fed well into their electoral propaganda. But, I think there was a realization there that until they had a mandate from the people, that really no amount of gun firing or, wars or uprisings was really going to hold sway anywhere. So that leads them into this idea of obtaining an electoral mandate, which they claim they got after the 1918 general election. So war and revolution is one side of the story, but then the electoral politics is really what gives them authentication to establish Dáil Éireann eventually in 1919, to show that they have the support of the people. And that's not particular to Sinn Féin. Unionists make the very same claim, particularly in Ulster, that they have won the majority support. So when it comes to partition, for example, they can lay claim that they have the support within the 6 counties. So elections, I think, allow for that sort of general consensus. And then bear in mind that you're at a time whereby the Irish Parliamentary Party is trying to prove to the House of Commons that they have the support of the people. The Unionists are trying to prove to the House of Commons they have the support of the people. Sinn Féin know they cannot do that, so they start to sell the idea that they are going to appeal to the Paris Peace Conference, which was the end of the war peace conference. And that was going to give them a voice to show they had the will of the people, and therefore they should be given the same rights as other small nations, as Woodrow Wilson was advocating for at the time. So, but it is very interesting that, I'm talking about violence at the elections, but for the most part, across most of these elections, with perhaps, areas of Belfast and Derry, Londonderry in 1921, that were particularly violent, most of them passed off fairly peacefully,
I mean, that is, so we tend to talk about the violent ones because they're remarkable. It wasn't violence across every constituency. That's an interesting point. It points to, or suggests to me, that there was a general, both amongst the political parties, their campaigners, and the voting public, there was an acceptance of the system, that they believed in the system. If I can get a mandate, the mandate I get is reliable from this system. Looking, as I was reading the book, it was around the same time as current events in America and questioning the vote, questioning the system. Are these votes really being counted right? All that kind of stuff. Was there ever, in your experience or in your research, ever a point where people doubted the counts or tried to question the system in an unknown way we've seen recently in the United States? Did that feature at all?
I didn't come across it. Now, there would have been sort of commentary after, and I'll just pick the 1918 general election because that was the big one. There would have been commentary on, and it was a difficult election to judge because of the things I've said, like it was first past the post. But then there was a number of uncontested constituencies as well. There was 25 uncontested constituencies in 1918. So you were trying to judge an election from only those constituencies that were contested, and yet then you would have had Sinn Féin that were claiming all of the constituencies, and in one way rightly so, because they had a walkover in those because they ran candidates in them. And then you have kind of you've the argument about Labour then during all of that time as well. I mean, Labour withdrew from the 1918 general election, and they didn't field candidates in the end of the day. And then if you look at the number of abstaining voters from this election, you can see that, you know, perhaps actually it wasn't that simple in the end of the day. It maybe was not a Sinn Féin walkover, because there might have been a lot of people that didn't want either or any of the parties that were running. They didn't want unionist, nationalist. In fact, they wanted something that was fitting to their lifestyles, which was Labour. Because at the end of the day, the high ideologies of home rule or independence or union are one thing, but really actually what I learned from studying this was that in the end of the day, it boiled down to the everyday issues. You know, who's going to pay the old age pension? What's our taxation going to be? And they started to take precedence as the election date drew nearer. And then you saw a swift change of tactic by a lot of the political parties that began to talk about issues like farming, taxation, old age pensions, education. And that's what people were interested in.
Yeah, it's the voter in the pocket, I suppose. Yeah, that's really interesting, and they tend not to get the high profile coverage because they're not questions of identity, but ultimately we all vote, mainly vote with our pockets, I suppose.
Well, but the other thing about it is the irony. I mean, talk about history rhyming. I mean, when you look back on some of the everyday issues that they were talking about at the time, the biggie is housing. And I mean, that's what
Yes.
we're talking about in all our elections. So 100 years later, we're still arguing the same toss, you know.
And there is a parallel between separatism and Brexit as well. There's something going on there. There's similar identity issues that are perhaps too big for this session. I'm just conscious of keeping people out of the questions now. There've been questions sort of coming in at a regular basis. So if you don't mind, we'll jump across and take some of the questions from the hall, as it were. One of the questions is, was there a lot of intimidation during the 1918 election, and did it affect the outcome? So you talked on violence there, but do you think that the violence affected the outcome of 1918, apart from uncontested seats, but intimidation on the day or intimidation during the campaign? Would you have any?
I do. I think it actually, I think a couple of things it did affect the votes. And I think that's where you have to look at who didn't turn up on election day. And when you look at the numbers that did not turn up on election day, there certainly is the argument to suggest that there was fear of intimidation and violence. And certainly bear in mind that it's not like today when you walk quite safely into your polling booth. This is kind of more reminiscent of elections that constantly bombarded you onto the moment of voting. And that could be quite intimidating. I mean, the visual propaganda alone was enough in some constituencies to put you off, because if you were nationalist in a very unionist constituency or vice versa, you know, you were walking into a tricolour dominated polling booth to cast your vote, or you were, you know, being inundated with union banners and flags as you were casting your vote. So even if it wasn't physical violence, it could have been the fear or potential threat that kept you away from the polling booth that day.
Yeah, and it's very hard to measure that. As a historian, it's very hard to measure, because writes down exactly, or very few people write down exactly what their feelings were. The question there coming up, as the thing that's often overlooked, while we think of 1918 as women getting the vote, and it's a huge culmination, while not all women get the vote, but they break that barrier at least. But also a huge amount of working class men got the vote in 1918 as well. And did that play a part in that campaign, either in who was being marketed to, and do you think it played a part in the results from 1918?
Well, I think both. You know, I mean, men over the age of 21 got the vote in 1918, as did servicemen over the age of 19. They also got the vote during that time. Women had to be over 30 years of age, and they still had some property restrictions also attached to that. Nonetheless, I think all of those sectors of society did impact on the election. But again, it's very hard to measure that in terms of how they voted. Where I think you can measure it more so actually is in terms of how they campaigned. And what you see, you know, on all sides, but particularly on the Unionist and Sinn Féin side, is that it is young men that go from county to county, particularly in the by-elections. You know, once they finished one county by-election, they move on to the next one.
Mobile team nearly, yeah.
Basically, yeah, to try and support their political party. And a lot of that is done by younger men, and it's also done by younger women as well. So I think certainly, and then again, you know, if you look at the newspaper reports of the time, you can see quite, as I've already said, a substantial amount of commentary on the amount of women that turned out on election day. So that would indicate that, yes, these new votes had a major impact.
Yeah, and it must have been such an exciting time, I think, because on such a, no one could predict what the outcome was going to be from 1918. I think it must have been a really sort of thrilling, depending on which side you are on. Another question coming in on the chat box there. This is from Adam, and he's a question saying that you'd mentioned this was in the motivation of voters. There was a drastic disparity between voter motivations in local and urban areas during this period. Can you expand a bit on that, and maybe on the importance of such as social considerations and social class, as opposed from capital P politics? What separated what rural voters voted about and urban voters voted for, around what was motivating them?
Yeah, I don't know that there was a big, huge difference between all of this. I mean, yes, there's a difference between what people vote for in a local election than what they vote for in a general election, and that was the same back then as it is today. I mean, certainly the local elections were all about, you know, rates and local parks, even amenities, things like that. Whereas the general elections were looking more, you know, people were more interested, as I've already said, on the bigger picture of taxation and pensions and the ideologies as well, high ideologies. But what you see in the local elections, what's interesting about the local elections when you look at 1920, particularly the urban local elections of 1920, is that you know, whilst there's a claim that the Irish Parliamentary Party are annihilated in 1918, when you go up and have a look at 1920, they're not actually annihilated. They're still there. They're still getting places on local councils. Now, that's not so much the case in the rural story, but it's certainly the case in the urban story. And what that would lead me to believe is that this might have been an election that was more akin to the 2011 election, where we saw Fianna Fáil nearly annihilated, but then they managed to come back subsequently. So it's interesting to look at the local elections to kind of get a clearer picture on the ground of how people are thinking. But, you know, they're also thinking about things like who's going to bring the rates down? Who's going to make public park? Who's going to, you know, carry out the job? Do we trust the old and tried and tested fellow or lass from times past, or do we take on this new Sinn Féin candidate that we know nothing about? You know, that would have played into it as well.
And local taxes was such a big part of people's sort of consideration and the rates and so forth, that I think if it's going to hit you in the pocket, it might change how you consider what candidate can save you money and so forth. No, I think that's really interesting. And that notion that the Parliamentary Party were annihilated in the general election of 1918, but they hadn't gone away. There was suddenly this, there's a deeper groundswell of respect or support that was there. But yeah, I think identity versus financial politics. I have a question coming in from Owen, who asks, in relation to newspapers and the language used in editorials, was that a force for political calm, or do you think that the commentary and the rhetoric actually fueled tensions? So I suppose tone of editorials, really, what was the impact on elections?
Well, you see, the important thing to remember about newspapers back in these times is that they were usually biased. So they supported one political movement or the other. So when you purchased the newspaper, you sort of knew the tone of the newspaper already. And you can even see that in some of the titles of the newspaper, like The Nationalist and Leinster Times. That's hardly going to be advocating unionism.
Absolutely.
But even if you take the national dailies of the time, I mean, everybody knew the Freeman's Journal was the Irish Parliamentary Party, the Irish Times was unionist. The Indo was kind of neutral between both, but they fell out with Redmond and his lot as well. But no, or I think actually that the newspapers, to be fair to the newspapers of the time, the editorial was just more inclined to report on what the speaker said and the audience reaction. And that's what I was interested in as well, is like, if the candidate made the statement, well, were they applauded, were they cheered, were they booed, were they hissed at, you know what I mean, that kind of thing. And it was also interesting to see how they reported on on things like the bunting, how people arrived at the speeches, in decorated motor cars. I mean, there's one instance where, there's some very clever things done during this time as well in terms of propaganda. Like, I mean, not only did they decorate the cars in the colours of the political movement, but like Sinn Féin, for example, changed the registration on all of their cars to, ER 1916. And, in another constituency, for one of the by-elections, the weather was absolutely appalling. It was snowing night, noon and morning. It was actually made the election very difficult. But then they began to use the snow to write in election campaigns like Up Plunkett or whatever it is. So, editorial picks up on all of this and tells you the story of what happened, as opposed to actually forming opinion. Now, that's not to say that opinion wasn't formed, it was, but any reader of the day would have been fairly aware when they were purchasing the newspaper what the bias was.
Yeah. It's interesting that, because we talk now about social media and having your social bubble, and I don't mean your COVID bubble, but your social media bubble, as in you only hear echoes of opinions that you already hold. You never hear the opposing opinion. But of course, that was ever true, because if you bought the Irish Times, you were unlikely to hear the Sinn Féin point of view clearly set out in the Irish Times. The idea of the newspapers covering the speeches and the response of the public to the speakers, is that like a rudimentary form of opinion poll or measuring popular sentiment, or did they have any kind of way of measuring sentiment before? I mean, was there any polling done? I mean, opinion polling done by parties at the time? Did that exist as a pursuit?
No, not opinion polling in the way we'd understand opinion polling today. But certainly there would have been, guesstimates as to what's going to happen. There would have been kind of a measuring of the mood. It was very anecdotal. I mean, there was no science to it. There was no mathematics to it. But there would have been they would have indicated how they thought the various candidates were going to do. But again, you have to take in the biases of the publications at the time, because they were always going to say that their own candidate was going to be the winner or was going to be the victor. And that was not always the case,
Imagine fake news. The question coming in there now, just squeeze in one or two more before we wrap up. The conscription, of course, conscription is such a huge cathartic thing in the Irish landscape in early 1918. Declan's asking, was conscription a big concern for voters, and how much of a part did it play in the campaigns?
It actually played quite a substantial part, particularly in the by-elections, because conscription was happening as some of those by-elections were playing out. And there's a lot of posters and handbills around that whole topic of conscription. And again, it very much depends. I mean, this is where the Irish Parliamentary Party kind of really faltered. And that was because up to this point, they'd been advocating for enlistment in the voluntary enlistment in the Great War. And now that that conscription was about to be introduced into Ireland in 1918, they were very angry at this, and they walked out of the House of Commons, in protest against the introduction of conscription. They returned to Ireland and they joined with Sinn Féin and various clergy and labour movements to protest against conscription. But at the same time, in the railway station and in the bus shelter, there is still war enlistment posters with, John Redmond or whoever it happens to be on it. So they're in a particularly difficult position when it comes to conscription. Sinn Féin have been fairly clear all the way through. They are anti-war and they're anti-enlistment. And then you have the flip side of all of that, and that's the unionist side, because they are, I'm not necessarily saying anybody is pro-war, but they're certainly in support of the war effort. And are actually nearly more angry that conscription wasn't introduced in Ireland at the same time as it was introduced in Britain, which was 1916. And that this was kind of shameful for the Irish people. That
be left out.
So you have a number of different opinions, but yes, conscription plays a big role in 1918, and where you really see Sinn Féin step up in terms of their kind of critique is you know, they're accusing the Irish Parliamentary Party of being involved in the war effort, and they have been on the anti-conscription side. Now, conscription is never introduced into Ireland. The war ends, and that's the end of that, you know.
The threat of it had such an impact. I always, it was such a, Sinn Féin must have been delighted with the electoral boon they were handed by this weapon to beat the Irish Parliamentary Party with.
I mean, they had two things happening at the one time. It was the failure of the Irish Convention and the introduction of conscription. So really, and of course, the introduction of conscription was weighted against Home Rule. You know what I mean? There was conditions and all the rest of it. So really, the Irish Parliamentary Party had to really begin to fight an uphill battle as the 1918 general election was approaching. They had it tough, you know.
And going back to speakers on platforms, I just can't imagine. I've never heard a recording of either. I don't know if either of them exists in recorded form, but I imagine John Redmond spoke one way on a platform. I don't imagine John Dillon was particularly, he never looks, in the cartoon versions of photographs, he never looks like a very dynamic performer on a platform. I don't know. And he seemed quite depressed by the time 1918 came around. I think he'd nearly given up the ghost politically at that stage.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. There's actually, I mean, you're still in the era of silent film, so you don't actually have voice recordings. But actually in Carlow, they have a great film of John Dillon arriving into the county in, I think it's 1913. You know, obviously it's all about Home Rule back then. They've marching bands and the town is out to kind of encourage them. I think there was a few behind the scenes encouraging the people in the town to come out and see. You know, but you can see you can see from his demeanor on that film that, you know, he's a little bit haughty and he's a little bit kind of sure of himself. And little does he know what's coming crashing down the line a few years later in terms of the elections.
Yeah, I think there was maybe a touch of squireocracy about some of the older
a little bit,
guys, and in their attitudes to women voters as well. It was like, well, they were a big tent party, I suppose. Just as we're heading towards wrapping up time there, one question came in, and they've anticipated a question I was going to ask. As I read through the book, and there's loads of different threads, and you could follow up in 100 different conversations, but did you have any sort of general takeaways from your understanding? Like, what would you say are the sort of one or two big things that you've learned about that period from the research that you did? I mean, there's a ton of work gone into this, but are there any one or two things that shine through about the importance of electioneering in that period that you'd be as sort of takeaway messages from the book, do you think?
Yeah, well, you know, I think actually it wouldn't do any harm for some of our politicians today to have a little look back in time to see just how well it was done in terms of the amount. I mean, and bear in mind, a lot of these political parties, while they fundraise, you know what I mean, both through their local associations and through their own members, and some of them over in the United States garnered quite sufficient money for election campaigns. They spent it reasonably wisely in terms of bombarding the population with very, very clever posters. And really, you know, credit has to go to the likes of Sinn Féin in this particular era, because they didn't just, you know, produce posters, they produced poster campaigns. And, you know, the same message was running through the posters, but the images were different. And we were all very familiar with the put him in to get him out post campaign at the time, which shows a soldier, or sorry, it shows a man dressed in a prison uniform. And it simply says, put him in to get him out, vote Eamon de Valera. And it really is translating as put him in government to get him out of a British jail, vote
really
whoever
effective.
that be. And, you know, it's, I suppose it's the cleverness that comes out of it. But the other thing that struck me about the propaganda and the publicity of elections during this time was the ability of, you know, unionists to drive home that whole message of empire, remain, stay, emulating an awful lot of what we hear in terms of Brexit these days, and running that as well across all of their poster campaigns. And, you know, using a little bit of fear into that as well. Well, you know, what's going to happen to your pensions if that lockdown south take over? And you know, what's going to happen to your house? Well, you won't have one, and all this kind of stuff. So there's a certain amount of fear going through it as well. But really, I suppose some of the clever things was taking empire or taking the Easter Rising and building a legacy from it, you know, picking up by unionists on some of that old home rule, anti-home rule stuff and running it again in the elections. Sinn Féin picking up on the Easter Rising, putting forward rebel candidates, using the message and legacy of that. And that's where I think the Irish Parliamentary Party had nothing to go with, because home rule was going on for 35, 40 years. There was nothing new in it. It was still on the statute book. They couldn't announce the new government in Dublin or anything, you know what I mean? So their message was staler.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. And the again, it's back to the notion of how modern and coherent the campaigns by the Unionists and Sinn Féin were, that they were fully knitted together, whole cloth campaigns that just linked up really nicely. I think that's been fascinating. I don't want to hold people on too much longer. And we've sort of got great value out of you, Elaine. So thanks for sticking so much. I'll hand back over to Owen now, but I really enjoyed that. My own copy is covered in pen notes, so I can never give it to anybody else now. That's on my shelf as a resource. But congratulations on the book. I really enjoyed it, and thanks so much for your time there.
Well, thank you very much, Ciaran. I really enjoyed that. And I just want to thank everybody out there that I can't see, but I'm delighted you all came along and joined us today. Thank you.
Here, back to you, Owen.
And thanks, Ciaran and Elaine. That was a really fascinating and comprehensive and detailed account of this period and its politics, and also the machinery of the politics, which I think is probably something which, you know, you've really sort of explored in great detail, Elaine, and it's just such a fascinating contribution to our understanding of this period, and an important one too. And we're very lucky to have you here at Carlow College, among a group of gifted historians here. I'd like also just to thank you, Ciaran, for your deft handling there of the session, and just to express our gratitude to you for your participation and probing questions. And finally, just to say thank you to everybody who joined us here today for this event. It was a very special event for us at the Research Hub, and a very special one, I know, for Elaine as well. And even though it was virtual, Elaine, and we couldn't have a big book launch, I hope that it was nonetheless interesting for our viewers, and also enjoyable for you and for Ciaran as well. So thank you to everybody. That's the end of the session. Thanks for coming along. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did too. So thank you once again. Bye-bye.
Hi, folks. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
See you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.